All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started with our work session tonight. So fun to see a big crowd to talk tax increment financing districts. So yes, I even heard a couple cheers. It's going to be a fun night, so we do not want to hesitate on getting going. Al, roll call.
Benson.
Here.
Brunig.
Here.
Johnson.
Present.
Maibaum.
Present.
Minor.
Here.
Schramm.
Here.
Weber.
Here.
Villanueva.
Here.
Mayor Moser.
Here.
City Manager Leon.
Here.
All right, now is the time and the place to address the City Commission on something not on the work agenda. All right, seeing no movement, we will go ahead and I will turn it over to City Manager Leon to get us going on tax increment financing districts 101.
Thank you, Mayor.
Take it away.
And Commission, members of the public. This is just designed to kind of send us back to school. Some of you have been involved in tax increment financing districts and are familiar with it. For those of us who have gone through that process and are familiar with it, it's been a long time since we've gone through that process. Both you and the Planning Commission have roles to play in that process. So Dave and I felt that it was a good idea to do a little bit of a review on, first of all, what tax increment financing districts are and what they do and how they work as an economic development tool for us, knowing that we may have some projects that come before us this spring that request that tool. So we thought it'd be nice to have some a refresher and some familiarity. Some of you that are newer to the commission, I don't think we've gone through that process yet. So this is just a good opportunity to learn, ask questions, get to know, and familiarize ourselves with what tax increment financing is. It is complex, and I don't expect everyone to have all their questions asked or answered yet this evening, but we can certainly follow up as a staff and answer more questions as you go along. So I am going to first hand it over to Dave Mingo. I think he's going to give us a little bit of a history, and then he'll introduce or reintroduce, I guess, our guest who's going to also help us walk through the tax increment financing discussion. Thanks, Dave.
Good evening. Yeah, I kind of wanted to start with just a little bit of history, and the best way to depict history, as Amy has told us over and over again, which is very wise, is with a map. So people can see a map and not have to create a vision in their mind about where something may have happened. Yankton, so far to date, has had 10 tax increment districts. Some of them did not get all the way through to final creation for one reason or another. As you can imagine, projects when they develop, there's a lot of variables, a lot of things in play. There's the typically, not always, but typically there's a private developer element involved, and so there's that variable also. So the 10 you see up on the map right now, Fox Run and Morgan Square, have sunsetted. Both were very successful. There was a first attempt at a tax increment district at the mall that made it about halfway through the process and didn't proceed for developer reasons. The Menards tax increment district was created twice in two different shapes. The first shape that was adopted, it was determined about 2 months into the process that there was a better way to describe the property to take advantage of as much development as possible. Westbrook, Phase 1 and 2, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with on the west side of West City Limits Road there. Circle C is one that not a lot of people are familiar with, but that's one of the first ones that Yankton was involved with for housing along with Westbrook, and that was a redevelopment project in its purest form because it used to be the old Circle C mobile home park, which, if you can remember that location on 10th Street, was in really rough shape. And then we did move along to another Yankton Mall, TID, where the increment from the hotel project only could be used as an incentive for the mall owner to do some facade improvements. That was a very small one. But with the hotel happening now and the facade improvements completed, it was performance-based, and so the Yankton mall owners did perform by finishing the facade improvements. We did have another one, Yankton tax increment district number 10 that got through a substantial amount of the process, but the prospect that was interested in the site ended up choosing an alternate location, so that did not proceed. So future tax increment districts you'll see will just follow that numbering system, 11, 12, and so on. One thing to be aware of is City Manager Leon said, is there are so many variables that can be involved, and that's why you have folks like Amy and myself and Toby Morris, who's going to give you kind of the basics presentation here in a second, and Ross to help you get through memorandums of understanding, TID agreements, tax increment district agreements, whether or not there's direct developer involvement. One of them that we're going to be talking about in the near term is going to be the city's the developer. It's next to the old the soccer complex that's being rebuilt, and there's some development property in there. So the city's technically based on previous agreements with the association, the developers. So lots of variables. Every agreement, every MOU is going to be different. Every developer's agreement is going to be slightly different, all falling, of course, within the South Dakota codified law associated with TIDs. The other thing before I let Toby come up and speak is City of Yankton, and I'm proud to say also, has been fairly conservative in our use of TIDs. There are some communities that are creating tax increment districts for, pretty much anything on a much more regular basis than us. And while it is one tool in the toolbox, and it's probably one of the most powerful local tools we have, I still think that just from a conservative standpoint, from a fiscally responsible standpoint, it really, to do a tax increment district, you really should be able to pass the but-for test, and I'm sure Toby will use this terminology, but would the development have happened at the level that it did but for the TID? So Fox Run, obviously there would have been some development in that area, never would have gotten to the extent and the value that it has current day without that tax increment district and the infrastructure improvements that were made as a part of that. So there'll be lots of time for questions and answers when Toby's done, but with that, I'll turn it over to Toby Morris for TIF 101.
Dave, while Toby's coming up, can I clarify on the map, 10 is actually 11? 11 is not a new proposal coming in front of us. There's an 11 on the map, but only 10 listed locations.
Correct. So there's 10 that have been in process.
Number 11 over here, is that a new one, or is 11 supposed to be 10, just to clarify, on the map? All the way over to the right,
Oh,
it's 11
sorry.
and not
I don't have
10.
my glasses
So is
on. I'm
there,
looking at the list.
I just want to clarify, 10 and 11 are the same areas.
That is actually 10 and not 11.
Okay.
That outline was 10. So
Okay, that's what we thought. I just wanted to clarify if anybody's looking at the map.
That's a number typo.
Thank you.
My apologies.
Thanks, Dave. Members of the council, Toby Morris, worked on and off with the city, I think, for about the past 20 years, from economic development projects to sales tax. Just have been very fortunate enough to work with the city. And as I looked at this, as Dave put this together, before I get into the TIF presentation, I think what's really neat was when we look at year 1 through 10, it's sort of a chronology of the history of TIFs in the state of South Dakota. Whether you consider it or not, the city of Yankton has been the leader in taking TIFs, you might say, to the next level. Because when we started out with Fox Run, I used to work for Governor Janklow, and a TIF was the only 3-4 letter word in the administration at that time. Just hated them. You guys put together a great one. It became phenomenally successful, but that was in the late 90s. And so governor at that time changed the tax increment laws to say it can only be used for industrial only. Governor Round steps in 2002. I believe at that time it was Mr. Ron Kraft. We lobbied Governor Rounds at that time to change it to more of an economic development side. So you can see again in the history of your TIFs what's happened is it went from Fox Run. Yeah, we worked on the mall at that time. That was an interesting one to say the least, but really it proceeded into Menards. You had the housing. Now all of a sudden retail follows rooftops and tailpipes. And as we know, cities live and die by sales tax. So the Menards, again, I would point as a very successful TIF. You know, you brought basically $40 million of sales tax. I live in Pierre, and the only way I can see my neighbor on weekends is go to the Menards in Rapid City, or as you guys would go up to Sioux Falls or Sioux City. You know, as you progress a little bit further, When you did the Westbrook one in 2015, that was the first of affordable housing. You had stipulations on the developer, and in fact, we used a lot of that model when we changed the law in 2016 with your local resident, Mr. Matt Michaels, to allow for economic development being associated with affordable housing, where the income limits, or not the income, the sale price of that came on. Again, we go back a little bit to the Yankton Mall. We were able to get that one through. Finally, it's coming along extremely well, it looks like. The facade is in place. Another one that's not on here, but it was a county one that I think proved to be very successful, was the Dakota Plains one. What you see in common a lot of this, though, is infrastructure. These were related to the infrastructure. The Menards didn't have the necessary infrastructure going north. The Dakota Plains, we didn't have that 5 miles of road. And economic development in this state, our biggest impediment is infrastructure. And so how we overcome that a lot is with the use of tax increment financing, and that's where I'll go through on this. And by all means, I'm an informal speaker. If there's something that comes up, if I say an acronym, I live and breathe it too much, and so, and 4 cups of coffee from Pierre, I might be a little jittery, so just let me know. You know, just on some of the projects I've served on throughout the years, not only to the community, served with the governor's office, advise them on any of their debt issuance, tax increment. You know, last week I'm in Box Elder, today I'm in Yankton. It's just a very broad approach. And of all the TIFs I've done, very, very few are ever the same. There's always a local element on there, and what I like about that is I always stress the city or the county is in the driver's seat. You're the ones that can control the formation, the shape, the direction of how a tax increment financing works. I joke around and you ask most people in South Dakota what a TIF is, and they're going to tell you it's a disagreement among newlyweds. When I worked for GOED, it was always fun to go to an out-of-state try to recruit a company and say, well, yeah, we have no tax here, no tax, no tax here. And you go to Iowa and they say, well, we'll just write you a check. And it was very difficult. So the TIF has become pretty much our only toolbox, because we have a couple taxes, you know, sales tax, property tax are our 2 main ones. I know you guys have been very progressive on doing a sales tax rebate, which is tremendous help to manufacturers because they have to get over that, you know, essentially 6% lift on their equipment when they come in. The acronyms, you'll see me interchange a little bit. A TID is the district. It's the legal definition. It's no different than the first slide where Dave pointed out the different tax increment districts within the state. The TIF is the financing that results for them. You know, I get a lot of times people say, well, Toby, you're the guru of a TIF, and it's not. Anybody can write the plan, but to get financing for the plan. And that's what really I'll stress on a little bit later is when it comes down to that financing, it's amazing how tough it can be, because you're asking somebody to lend money to put their asset underground that has no value the minute it goes in. The land does, but that's generally held by a mortgage from the bank. So that's what makes these so difficult, in a lot of ways I'll show you later of how you can do it non-conventional, you can do it conventional. I usually just go seek out the most non-conventional way, because a non-conventional lender generally has more sense of a humor than a bank does if you're late on a payment. A bank has no sense of humor. It's pretty well black and white. You're late or you're early. There's no in between. We use them to encourage development of deteriorated or blighted areas. Well, when we did TIFs early on, we're very proud in South Dakota that the law that we have was basically copied from Illinois law. And so it's not quite applicable to South Dakota. So when you would say the word blighted, you'd immediately take offense if I had to say the cornfield is blighted because it lacks infrastructure. So now we've since modified that even more to allow for economic development. And what I really like the word of economic development when we changed this, and I think it was 2010 or 11, it allows you as the city of Yankton to determine what economic development is. Is it the Gale or Manitou expansion? You go to Eagle Butte, it could be a veterinarian. You go to Sioux Falls, it's downtown CNA. It's really a broad approach to whatever the city feels that their goals are to be to achieve if you were to use tax increment financing. The basics of it are this. You have that blue area. That's what's considered the base. So nothing changes if you have just bare ground and you have assessed value at $1. The gray area represents the minute you go vertical, something comes out of the ground. So if you have $1 today, that stays in there. That goes back to the normal taxing entities that receive it. The gray is the increment, and that's what I always focus on, because in order to get the financing to work, I have to understand what the increment is. Some of the easier financings are a single piece because you know what it's going to be, like a manufacturing. Some of the most difficult ones are housing, because are you building 10 homes, 15, 20? When are they all coming on? What's the repayment structure? And if there's any kind of TIF that can get turned upside down, more than likely it's going to be on a housing TIF, just because if the developer doesn't get out of bed for a couple months, that's a compounding effect on the longevity of that revenue that's coming in. The but-for test, Dave said that. I call it the smell test. Does this smell right? Is it going to pass the public process? Would this have happened but for the TIF? There's a lot of different ways that you can look at it for that. If you know the project's coming in and it's going to happen regardless, it probably doesn't pass the smell test by any means. Things I always look at then is who will be the borrower. Is the city the borrower? Very, very rarely will I ever recommend a city to be the borrower. And maybe it's an interfund loan and you know what you're getting into going in. You know that you maybe fall short. But if you have to take out a loan based on a developer's projections, that puts you a little bit at risk. It just all depends on where that's going. So we look at that very closely. If you can have it as a developer TIF and you pass it on to them, great. That is the less riskiest way, you might say. You mitigate the risk, but each one of these stands on itself. Lastly, we look at how will the TIF be classified. There's a couple different ways. When I mentioned earlier, Jankla was an industrial only. Then we modified it to be economic development. Economic development basically said, is there a commercial component involved with this? There is now the other classification that's called affordable housing. And the fourth classification is considered other. Because you're always going to ask the question, will this TID raise my taxes? If it is classified as other, yes, it will. It's a rounding error, but the minute you say you're raising people's taxes, you better be running and not looking back. So that's why we always go for the economic development, the affordable housing, or the industrial. There's maybe 10 TIFs in the state that are outstanding right now that are classified as other. If you want to know how many TIFs are in the state, we track them. These are all the existing TIFs right now. I think there's close to about 200. Every county, well, except for about 4 counties, I should say. Some communities have over 100 TIFs. You were approaching your 11th TIF. Well, in actuality, it's only going to be your 9 because those 2 were never created. In Pierre, I think we're at number 7. Mitchell's maybe at 22. So it just varies from town to town in terms of how that they were used. The people who complain the most about the taxes all of a sudden become the biggest proponent of the school because they're now concerned that the school is going to lose funding. The answer to that is no. The school is made whole on their state aid formula. And so that is the other reason why we look at it. And even if it was done as an other, the school's general fund is always made whole. So what's that mean for us sitting in this room? Essentially, when TIFs are equalized statewide, and the legislature gets together and they do their state aid formula, the TIFs are held outside of it. So we probably subsidize my TIF in Pierre, your TIF here in Yankton. I've looked at it. It's another, I would call it a rounding error. It's maybe 1/100th of 1 mil. Very, very minor, but that's how the state aid is made whole to each and every school. And by design, it's meant to be that way because you don't want to get the school punished for economic development events. The schools will tell you, the way the funding formula goes, they are funded on heartbeats. They need kids. And so it's interesting to see around the state, you'll see some schools, I call it pirate from other districts, but every kid is worth maybe $8,000 to $9,000 between the capital outlay and the state aid formula. So that's where it's going. So if you're doing a housing TIF, the schools, and I can't speak for them, but they say, hey, we're very supportive because if you can keep a family of 4 here with 2 kids, I've got $18,000 that's coming in. Industrial, yeah, hey, we're doing the jobs. So again, it goes back to that smell test of why you're proposing a TIF. Covered that. The business plan, who, what, where, when, why. It's really just taking your best guess based on today's knowledge and moving forward. The problem with TIFs is the minute you create it, you have to create the TIF before your actual costs are incurred. So you're really taking a projection of what it's going to be. It's almost, I wish we could work it backwards where you see what your costs are, then we create the TIF to do that. But that's, what we put in there. We put in what are the proposed improvements. Again, it's very transparent so the public can see it. There's available, you can do capital costs, financing costs, real property assembly. These are all ones that I'll use. Ones I don't use, as you're going to see, is anything like a developer fee. Of all the ones I've done, we don't put developer fees in there. Is it legal? Yeah. Does it stink? Yeah. So it's being able to negotiate with that developer at that time to determine why would you need that in there. Even on engineering, a lot of times I might write in there and say, yeah, we're only going to allow 50% of the eligible costs of the engineering. Because what you have to look at is really what does that TIF sustain and where it can go. So I always say, what you call a non-pushy, non-shovey developer, right? Broke. So they're going to come in, and this happens to me all the time, and they're like, Toby, I need $5 million of TIF. And I say, developer, your TIF isn't worth more than $2 million. So how you want to get to 5, it doesn't work. And so you have to show them the numbers where you take the revenue first and you back it in. And here's a point in case. Here's a deal that we did on the Kimball shuttle loader. When you're driving on 990 looking to the north, what we said there is, okay, we analyzed what this TIF is. It produced roughly about 150,000 years with the taxes, extrapolate that out. And the developer says, I have $8.4 million of expense. Yes, you do. I'm not disagreeing with you. I said, but you only have $2,070,000 of revenue. And how we want to allocate that revenue is what we did here. So we took that actual, and we knew we didn't include the land, we didn't include the road improvement. What was interesting on that road improvement is you'll see there's a county admin fee of $100,000 in there. And that's where I think worked with you, Brian, where we then applied to DOT. We used that $100,000 as match money to generate from the DOT program at that time. So we took that $100,000 and actually generated about another $300 into that. And that was an eligible use on that. The electrical you'll see is we put in at $1.2 million, all because I'm backing into that $2 million number. I'm not backing into 8, and there's so many plans I see nowadays that are written, and they just come out of nowhere. They've got $14 million, and I'm like, how are you going to generate $14 million in roughly 17 years? That's a tremendous amount. The highest TIF I've ever done was for $15 million, but that was on a $250 million expansion of Agri-Pier in Lake Norden. So we knew that assessed valuation was going to come in at roughly $40 million at 20 mils. It's producing $800,000. And so that's where you get creative committees is what I call them. You just got to push them to the side and say creativity doesn't work in bank or financing. It always comes back to the numbers. You adopt the plan. You file it with State of South Dakota. It's registered, as you saw in my book earlier. The State Department of Revenue, they track each one. They give an outstanding report to the legislature every year of the number of TIFs, the classifications, what the total value is. And it's actually a very powerful report because it shows you, like if I pull up, it shows you what your increment has done. So like if we were to go to some of your first ones and take a look at, let's see here. Westbrook Estates. That was the one with the partnership Thrive now, right, Amy? Okay, I'm catching up. So that in itself produced affordable housing, and you might say the but for would have happened but for that TIF, and I would have said no. Now you have roughly $20 million of increment that has come on to go back and pay for that infrastructure, to pay for the risk that you took, the YEPG took, that proved to be a good story. So each and every one of these is tracked in terms of what the total increment is produced from when it started to where it is today. One of the most important things that you get into this when you work with a developer, if it's not a city developer, is the developer's agreement. You're going to create a plan. The plan is an outline of what you think is going to happen. The developer agreement states what will happen, how it will happen, and who's responsible for each one. And so, again, you're in control of this because you think of the flow of funds. If you have a developer agreement that's broken, the developer, the people in the district are paying the taxes to the county. The county segregates that, passes on to the city. The city is now in control of the flow of funds, so if the developer agreement's ever broken, you don't pass that money on. Very, very powerful in negotiating when you're sitting with the money at that point. It's the binding document that holds true. Now, granted, it can be flexible. You're going into development with a developer, so it's not sometimes always black and white. You know, oops, do happen every now and then. Thing I like to look at it here is the roles and the responsibilities. The timing of the improvements is critical. Just because you get a TIF doesn't mean you have 5 years to put it in or 7 years to put it in. You want to stipulate it because you're doing it right here, right now. We don't need road, water, sewer in the year 2028. We need it right here in 2022. It also talks about the amount not to exceed, the amortization, the interest rate. I've often said if I would have used my knowledge for evilness, I'd be retired on TIFs, because I've come across some of them where developers basically wrote the plan, they put in 7%, and it became an annuity for them. So as you saw earlier, when I go back and say, this is the project cost of $2 million, what you don't see on there is interest expense. And so we impute it at a 0. There's some that you can impute it on, but it's not meant to be a runaway interest expense train by any means. And so that's where I always have an amount not to exceed. That amount is either going to be at the end of X number of years, you can't exceed 20, or once it hits that dollar amount. The other thing that I should have put in here, and I've learned this through scar tissue, is what happens if that property's sold? Who maintains ownership of that TIF? I learned this the hard way on Pomida and Chamberlain. And Pomida and Hot Springs, the developers were pretty savvy. They came in, they created the project, the building, brought in Pomida. All of a sudden, Pomida leaves. They sell the building to another owner, but they kept the ownership of that TIF. So these are just things that you sort of learn along the way that says, okay, if for some reason the original use of the TIF happens to change in years 8 or 10 or 12, the city reserves the right to come back and either negotiate with the new owner, because it might be an incentive tool, or to dissolve it. So those are things that I put in there. The indemnification of the city, the county is always very important as well. Again, we always state that the conduit, you're a conduit, but if the developer's taking out any debt, you'll do an assignment of payment, but you're not responsible for anything on that part. Establish of the tax base. Covered that. You know, you can't go after 20 years past the creation. I always try to keep you guys in the driver's seat by any means. The hardest part, again, always goes back to the debt, trying to find a lender. So pre-08, we would do 2 loans for a developer. We do a TIF loan and we do their normal conventional loan. The TIF loan would come in and be the equity into the project, which spells leverage. Well, 08 through 14, 15 happened, and so you couldn't even do that. Now lenders are coming back and they're starting to do that, because as humans, our memories are a little bit short every now and then, and so you'll see that as a lender who understands the TIF financing. And there are some that really understand it, and there's some that shouldn't even be in the business, because you've got to be very careful. I've come across a bank that says, oh yeah, we'll take the TIF down, and then I look at the projections and they're charging the developer 10%. I'm like, no, that dog does not hunt. That's not right. This is meant to be as a way to get the infrastructure in, but again, not to create that annuity. So the devil's always in the details, especially on those developers agreement. Or, in my case, I just don't impute an interest rate, so I don't care if you charge 20 to the developer, you're not getting $1 more out of this TIF than what it states right now. The MOU. I've really been a fan of this and started moving to this a couple years ago, because what this really does, I can spend 30 hours writing a TIF plan, bring it forward, and just get shot down. And I was like, wait a minute here, this isn't working. So let's spell out what expectations are from the very beginning. What is it that you, Mr. Developer, are looking at? It's a non-binding form of an agreement, but at the same time, we're all South Dakotan enough that if you say what you're going to do and we say what we're going to do, we can get to that legal definition when we get there. There's times that we'll do revenue sharing. In particular, like the city of Harrisburg, just growing leaps and bounds, and it can't keep up with all their infrastructure costs. So we'll do a TIF for a large developer, but we're taking 30% for the city. And that 30% then comes back and it's designated, whether it's in a stoplights, whether, I don't want to say the word roundabout, but that's what they're looking at. And so, it's then at the city's discretion of where they take that, because it's a new revenue stream that they're not able to generate from sales tax, and so that's been very successful. We put timeline milestones in the MOU. It's essentially a mini TIF plan that we're bringing forward, again, in the spirit of transparency, to let the public, the council, and everybody else know. I go a step farther and make certain we share it with the school. The school technically doesn't have a say in the TIF. Politically, absolutely. I remember the worst days of my career, and I'm talking to one city, and my other line's ringing in, and it's a superintendent, and they're just in a big grouchy match with one another whether this TIF should go through. So I'm like, I'm going to get fired from both, is what I was thinking. And so it's just covering your political base. Share it with the county as well to let them know. Technically they're not a part of it, but yes, they are. So I think it's just good stewardship to let everybody know what's going on. Annual appropriation. So one of the things every finance officer gets beat into their head when they go to municipal league is constitutional debt limit. And there was times where we would have to take a small city and ask Big Brother County to do a TIF, because even if it's a developer TIF, legislative audit considers it constitutional debt. So after about 4 years of spinning out with those guys, I was actually with your local famous resident, Mr. Matt Michaels, and we were talking, and he was giving me the history, which he was so good about South Dakota, of why constitutional debt was implemented in South Dakota. The state of South Dakota actually has a constitutional debt limit of $100,000. So it got me thinking, why don't we take the language whenever the state borrows money and applies it to a tax increment district, where it now does not count as constitutional debt and really becomes a form and function of the council. Whenever they approve their budget, they're approving the TIF. And so we've since been able to get legal opinions and legislative audit to sign off on that. I don't see that too much of a concern for Yankton, being with your valuation as high as it is. If you go to Tyndall Tabor, that's where you use that language, is more so over there. Lastly, the MOU actually helps the developer with getting financing. I'm sort of a proof of life guy. If a developer's coming in, I'd like to see some kind of commitment letter from their bank. There's nothing worse going through the hoops, putting the TIF in place, and then all of a sudden the developer's not financeable. So those are things I always just ask right up front. We just assume somebody can get the lending. We can't assume on that, especially when you go through the whole process. We've somewhat done that here with the mall. That was an uphill challenge, and it took me, I think, 2 years to get that bank on board. But that is what happens when you work with a sort of a non-capitalized developer. The other thing, too, I look at, we live in a small state. Do the history of a developer you're working with, do your research, call around. I do that all the time. You might not find their track record to be as rosy as what they painted it. There's always a story that goes along with everything. Ronald Reagan said it best, trust but verify. And that's something that you do as well. Because past performance, Zig Ziglar, past performance predicts future performance. It's sort of that simple, and you want to make sure you have it all shored up, because there's varsity developers, there's junior varsity developers, and there are people that should never have the name developer associated with them. So it's trying to figure out who those are, because if a TIF goes bad on you, that's when the problems really start to happen. You're immediately calling Ross and his colleagues and saying, what's going on here? And, we've had a few Supreme Court cases out there. It's not fun to get drug into that, so. You being the developer. Oh, all right. Couple items. I don't know what, they shut that off or, no big deal. I don't know. Oh. I'm not an iPad guy. There we are. A lot of times the city will act as a developer, they'll do an interfund loan. So you create the obligation within your tax increment fund. Al's done this, very good. You might have your sales tax, your capital project fund, pay for it up front. And then as long as you have that obligation to collect that from the TID, it then stays within that fund. Once the TID or the TIF starts producing, it comes into there, then Al can transfer it over into another capital projects fund. And so that's a lot of times what you'll see of any kind of city-backed TIF on that. City of Spearfish just did a big one. I think at Municipal League, I don't know if you saw the housing, did this incredible housing project out there, very progressive and aggressive. They had a TIF that might not pay for itself, so they issued about $14 million of sales tax, and within that, they had an interfund loan that would come from the TIF as repayment over time. And so you do see that as well. Like I mentioned, you can use the TIF proceeds as a match for grants. You can do a lot with them. I try to be careful with the word creative, because if you try to out-creative yourself, then everybody gets confused. And remember, when things go wrong, it's somebody else 5 or 7 years down the road that's trying to figure out how you got yourself into this mess, because we're probably not at the table or something when that happens. So I like to have them pretty clear cut of how it's going to work. Oh. I think that's about it. Wow, nobody's sleeping yet. That's a good sign. Questions, comments, concerns, jokes?
Maybe two quick things. Is when we do developer-driven TIFs, they're performance-based. So if there's no increment coming in, if that developer's not creating something taxable property there where there is an improvement, that if there's no increment coming in, there's no payment going out. So it's totally performance-based. And then it's capped on top of that too. It's capped with an amount that's just established in a development agreement, in a TID agreement, and it's also capped obviously by state law with the number of years that it can pay out. So it's not a continuous source of income beyond what was identified in the plan. The couple that might be coming at you this year are going to be more city being the developer role. And in an instance like up by the soccer complex, when you're not developing both sides of a piece of infrastructure, or you even have a piece of infrastructure that maybe is never going to have development adjacent to it, but you need it to make a connection just for transportation needs, that's going to be the type of a district that we're going to have a capital project, associated with it. So there'll be an expenditure out of the capital improvements plan you'll see in your budget process this year proposed probably for a project like that, just to get the project to be able to happen, because going in, we all understand that the district's not going to cover all of the expenses associated with it, and we knew that when we took the soccer land, off the table for development purposes. So just part of how those things will get packaged.
I am curious when you talk about the differences in cities, how they're using them, how many each have. You talked about Mitchell with 22. Us, we're looking at 10-ish. I don't know how to better ask this question, so I'll just shoot straight. Can a city out-TIF itself? Well, you talk a lot about best practices, so I guess I'm looking at, and obviously with our 10-ish, I don't think that's anything for us necessarily to be worried about, but in your work through the years, can a city get beyond what they can do with programs like this? Can they outdo themselves or get in trouble that way? Is there a magic number or best practices when you're looking at that?
I call it TIF fatigue, is what I call it. And yes, it can happen. And, I'll take, in the case of Harrisburg, we said we're only going to do so many for residential because we knew retail follows rooftops and tailpipes. And so we put a moratorium on any more residential. And it's really what I encourage cities to do and say, you know, work with the Nancys. Where is your goal for the next couple of years? And you can just say, hey, look, we plan on doing, you know, these kind of TIFs over here, and you can lay it out. Constitutionally, you can only have so much of aggregate TIF base that you can't exceed. And, you know, here's a good story. So Meade County got creative one year. And Meade County is huge. I think, I don't know how many thousands of square miles. It's bigger than the state of Rhode Island, right? So they had a 200 million or 300 million valuation, whatever it is. They created basically a 50-mile wide TIF, and they were going to play the appreciation game. As this land appreciated, they were going to capture that increment off of that. So that draws the attention, again, if you want to out-TIF yourself. There's others. Rapid City ran into it, and it was quite part of the mayoral race probably 5-7 years ago, where they pulled way back and were not handing them out like candy. And so it just all depends. I think Sioux Falls maybe has 12 or 14. Some are very conservative. Your faster growing towns with very little retail base, like Box Elder. So here you've got this base that's coming in, dropping down, putting 7,000 people in the next 5 years, and you really have a couple hotels. You don't have a main street. They're using TIF more and more because you don't want to spend $140 a month to flush a turd, because that doesn't work. And so they have to use the TIF to offset what would be their water sewer rates. So, sorry, did I take my filter off, Amy?
No, we just all looked at Kyle because he's going to raise our sewer rates, so we just wanted to make sure he heard you.
I was
Yeah,
going to say, I think Kyle would spend at least that if he let him.
yeah. But you know, that's what happens when you put up a $30 million treatment plant and you have 4,000 residents. It's terribly expensive. So we'll use a TIF to offset stuff like that.
Toby, you've talked about the different classifications for tax increment districts. When was the affordable housing designation dreamed up? When was that first implemented here in the state?
That was in 2016, that went in 2017. And what that was based on is essentially the homes that are built within that area, the first sales price cannot exceed first-time home buyers. So this last year, that price was $300,000. When this first started out in 17, I think it was maybe $240,000, $250,000. So it gradually increases every year. I'm a proponent of that because you don't want to see, you know, $500,000, $1 million homes being used as a tax increment district, and it's meant to, you know, be for the workforce, affordable housing.
And then can you talk a little bit more, you mentioned it earlier, when Westbrook Estates was being dreamed up here in Yankton, I guess with the assistance of Matt Michaels and his insight as well. So that classification of economic development is what has helped make Westbrook Estates happen here, and why was that important at that time? And perhaps even if we're looking at doing some version of affordable housing here inside of Yankton again in the years to come, is that still something that we should consider ahead of an affordable housing designation?
Definitely. So that one was done in 2015, if I remember right. And so, you know, YPG went out and recruited the developer, Kelly Nielsen, to come in, worked the deal out, and did the self-imposing limits. I think it was, what, 210, 215, or memory serves, 206? 206. And so that became the basis, really, I think, of how we started to formulate the change in the law for that. We had that created as economic development because we essentially gerrymandered the boundaries to capture some commercial area to fall under the economic development side of the state. I knew we could back it up because we still had the self-imposed sale price on there, so you can't say you're subsidizing the rich. It was meant to be in what it is, because the person who received the most value out of that TIF is not the developer YPG, but the person who bought that home. And so they receive the direct benefit, essentially equity into their house. So I see them more and more. I'm a little worried with this legislation that came through this year because the housing has 200 million, 100 million grant and 100 million loan to get out. And one of the things that they're going to be looking for is local participation. So does that mean that local participation has to be a TIF? And you want to be careful, you don't want to over TIF everything, because sometimes if you're getting a grant and a low interest loan, I would contend you don't need a TIF at the same time. That's triple dipping. So when those rules start to come out and the public input is in May, I think we're going to have to be very careful on that, just so we're not handing out TIFs like candy.
Dave, it would be helpful, I think, for me to have a reminder on the actual process. So once we've had a developer contact us about a tax increment finance district, the various approvals it needs to go through, and then the time frame and when the TID clock starts.
So at the administrative level, typically a lot of the negotiations or the discussions with the developer have occurred, and you've got a general idea of what would be included in the MOU and the eventual development agreement. Then the rest of it is kind of straightforward in South Dakota codified law, where the Planning Commission has a first and second reading. Their second meeting is their public hearing. The City Commission then can directly thereafter consider the resolution that actually formally creates the TID. So the formal hearing is at the Planning Commission level in the process. So, barring special meetings with our schedules in Yankton here, it's 2 months, 2.5 months, maybe a little quicker than that, depending on where it falls in the calendar. I mean, the big part of it is getting those agreements in place, so.
And then the years you have to,
I'm sorry. Yeah, so you have 5 years to expend your TID eligible expenses, whatever you've identified in the plan. So if you're going to put a road in, you have to get that in the ground and paid for within 5 years. And then you can, again, the maximum time limit on when you can recoup that from the increment is 20 years. So you got to get the infrastructure, the expenditure done within 5 years. And there's some contractual ways to work through different scenarios depending upon all the variables that can come into play with grants or other eligible expenditures of that nature. And Toby can help you understand that aspect of it better than I can. But yep, 5 years.
Do you have a TIF application that you guys have created, or TIF guidelines? I don't know. See Dave? Cities will call me and they say, Toby, we want to hire you to write our TIF policy. And I said, you don't want to do that because you're going to pay me twice as much to get around that same policy you thought was a good idea 4 years ago. So do guidelines.
we did talk about that after the Menards TID, but, we felt like part of the beauty of that tool is that you have the flexibility and you can be creative, and so, to some extent. So we wanted to have that ability, and, and I think that's probably was a good idea in the sense that I don't think the recent TID at the mall would have followed any policy or step-by-step guideline that we might have created.
No, I think that
So we
one
just
was-
followed statute, and
I think
call
you
Dave
titled
and call
that,
you.
pull yourself through a keyhole on that.
I've titled it a lot of things.
But yeah, some cities have guidelines, they have application. It's really to each their own on how they want to look at it.
Are there some ways that you have, I guess you've talked a little bit about some of the scars that you've acquired over the years, so good wisdom to potentially tap into here. I'm just curious, have there been situations where you've seen the 20 years are up and everybody's really happy about how things are playing out? We got this, much larger infusion of cash that's now going into city, county, school coffers, et cetera. And then all of a sudden there's this big gotcha, like, oh, geez, we did 20 years worth and now we're a couple years in, and then this thing happens, and now all of a sudden it kind of puts a wrench into what we thought was 20 years well spent.
Yeah, I came across an ethanol plant where they paid 22 years, so we had to correct that on that. So TIFs they're an unregulated economic development tool, and there's days I wish they were regulated, and there's days I'm glad they're not regulated. So we really all become our own police with it. And that's why you always want to have verbiage in the developer's agreement that allows an amendment to it based on both parties agreeing. Because bumps in the road will happen with development. And, sometimes the problem with cities is it's always black and white with the city because you're able to always capitalize things. We saw what happened in Sioux Falls when they became a partner on that downtown hotel and parking ramp. The developer wasn't capitalized. And then that's one of those deals that became an oops on that part. So you try to think of the boogeyman committee up front to protect you, but you will have an oops eventually. Not intentionally, but there will be one that comes. I've been doing this now for 20-some years, and I'm going back to some of the 07s or 10s. And I was like, oh, I didn't think of that. But so I don't know if that helped answer that or not.
Oh, sorry, just always thinking about worst case scenarios. You never know.
So to me, the key is that if the city's the developer, then we got to just know the risk going in. And the ones that you may see later this year, there's an anticipated shortfall just because of how the projects, are going to come together without fully developable areas on both sides of the infrastructure in one instance. And when it's a developer-based hit, it just goes back to that performance-based, set up the agreement so you only pay the increment out that you receive. So then it's on them to perform, really.
And Dave, this is a question I know the answer to, but so we decide we don't want to take the risk. It's risky, but we want the how do we pay for that then?
Yeah, well, we'll have to talk to Adam about.
Take everything out of the 506.
Take everything out of the 506 except one development this year, which, the community is going to struggle with having an appetite for that too. But that's the other way is you just spend your capital money on it. And when you're talking about a $3.5 or $4 million project, that's going to really restrict what you can do for a few years in the rest of your capital budget. So.
Other questions from the commission? We have a couple minutes yet to give everybody a quick break and reset. No? Nobody else? All right. Well, thank you, Dave and Toby, Dave has to be here. So Toby, thank you for coming down tonight. As always, very informative for us to know how all of that works. There is no other business in front of the City Commission for the work session tonight, so I would ask for an adjournment of the work session.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Anybody abstaining? All right, work session is adjourned, so that gives us all about 6 minutes for a quick break.